the heart of the bustling city. A towering glass building stood proudly as the headquarters of one of the most successful corporations in the country. From the outside, it looked like any other modern skyscraper with sleek windows reflecting the sunlight. But inside, it was a different world entirely. The company was run by a man who had everything: wealth, power, and influence. His name was known by almost everyone, and his decisions impacted the lives of countless people. He walked through the hallways with an air of confidence, his sharp suit and polished shoes clicking against the marble floors as if he owned the place. And in many ways, he did. The CEO's office was the largest on the top floor, offering a panoramic view of the city below. It was a space filled with luxury: leather chairs, expensive artwork on the walls, and a desk that looked like it belonged to a king. Yet despite the lavish surroundings, the CEO's demeanor remained cold and calculated. He was a man who didn't believe in the power of art, creativity, or passion. He believed in numbers, strategy, and hard decisions. To him, success came from long hours of work and making the right deals, not from something as intangible as talent or skill. One morning, the CEO held a meeting with his senior staff. The meeting was set to discuss the company's next big project, but as he entered the room, he was in a playful mood. He had just come from a personal victory, sealing a major deal with a powerful business partner, and his confidence was at an all-time high. As the team gathered around the table, the CEO leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. "You know," he began, "I've always believed that success is about doing the right thing at the right time. It's about managing people, making tough calls, and of course, knowing how to handle pressure." He glanced around the room looking for a nod of agreement, and found it in the eyes of the executives. "I'm sure we all agree," he continued, "that anyone can be successful in business as long as they've got the drive and the brains for it. I mean, look at me. I didn't start with much, but here I am, sitting at the top of the food chain." The CEO chuckled at his own words, clearly pleased with the image he had painted of himself, but not everyone in the room shared his enthusiasm. Among the crowd of well-dressed, powerful individuals was someone who had worked in the building for years, but was hardly ever noticed. An old janitor who kept the hallways clean, the restrooms tidy, and the floors shining. He was just another face among the many, with no real title, no office, and no recognition. To the CEO, he was invisible. The janitor was a quiet man, humble and reserved. He never bothered anyone, and no one really bothered him. He did his job well and stayed out of the spotlight. But today, something about the CEO's words rubbed him the wrong way. He wasn't the kind of person to speak up, but the CEO's assertion that success was only about drive and brains made him feel as though his own life was being dismissed. He had always believed that success was more than just work and intellect. It was about passion, talent, and a willingness to go beyond what was expected of you. But here was the CEO, dismissing everything that didn't fit into his narrow definition of success. As the CEO rambled on, the janitor felt his frustration building. He had always kept his head down, working silently and diligently, but he was also someone who had a hidden talent, something that the CEO would never know about. In his free time, the janitor played the piano. It wasn't just a hobby for him, it was a passion. He had grown up learning the instrument and spent years honing his skills, even though he never had the chance to showcase them in the world of business or high society. To him, music was as important as any other skill, maybe even more so. The janitor's fingers were as skilled on the keys as any concert pianist's, though no one in the building had ever seen him play. He had no desire to show off. It was just something he did for himself, something that brought him peace. But today, as the CEO continued to talk about how anyone could be successful with hard work and a sharp mind, the janitor's thoughts began to shift. He stood up suddenly, without thinking, his voice a little shaky but steady. "Excuse me, sir," he said. The room fell silent. The CEO stopped talking and turned his gaze to the janitor. It wasn't common for someone of his position to interrupt, especially not in front of such an important audience. The janitor's heart raced as the eyes of the room turned to him. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I have to disagree," he said, his voice more confident than he had expected. The CEO raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the interruption. "Go on," the CEO said, intrigued but still amused. The janitor took a deep breath before continuing. You say that anyone can be successful if they have the right drive and the right brains, but I think you're forgetting something. There's more to success than just that. It's not all about how smart you are or how much you work. There are things like talent, creativity, and passion that you can't just force into existence. The room was quiet. The senior staff exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. The CEO's smirk faded, but he remained calm. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone more curious now than mocking. The janitor hesitated for a moment, then spoke with more conviction. "I'm suggesting that sometimes talent can make all the difference, and that's not something you can always measure with numbers or business strategies." The CEO chuckled, a light laugh that was almost dismissive. "Talent, huh? And where would we find that? Here in the janitor's closet?" The room filled with nervous laughter. The CEO was trying to lighten the mood, but the janitor wasn't fazed. "I'm not talking about business talent," the janitor replied. "I'm talking about a different kind of talent, one that's often overlooked in places like this. Something that takes years of practice, not just work. Something that requires a deep understanding, not of spreadsheets, but of something intangible." The CEO stared at him, his amusement replaced by curiosity. "And what exactly are you proposing?" he asked again, a little more seriously this time. The janitor, feeling the eyes of the room on him, knew this was his moment. "I challenge you to a piano duel," he said. "I'll play something for you, something difficult, something like Chopin. If you can play it as well as I can, then maybe you're right. Maybe talent doesn't matter." The room went completely silent. No one had expected this. The janitor, of all people, was challenging the CEO to something as unexpected as a piano duel. The CEO's initial reaction was to laugh, but he stopped himself when he saw the seriousness in the janitor's eyes. "Chopin," the CEO said slowly. "You want me to play Chopin?" "Yes," the janitor replied. "I know you probably don't think it's important, but it is. Music is about more than just hitting the right notes. It's about understanding the piece, feeling it, and I'll bet you can't do it." For a moment, the CEO was silent, considering the challenge. Then his lips curled into a smile and he leaned back in his chair. "You're on," he said. "Let's see if you're as good as you say you are." And so, the challenge was set. Neither man knew what would happen next, but both had something to prove. The CEO, confident that his status and intellect would carry him through anything, and the janitor, determined to show that talent and passion could never be dismissed, no matter how powerful the person was. The stage was set. The game was on, and neither of them knew just how much this moment would change their lives. The challenge was set. The janitor's words had stirred something in the CEO that he hadn't expected. Doubt. It wasn't doubt about his intelligence or his ability to manage, but doubt about something much deeper. Could he really play the piano? Could he show anyone that despite his business success, he wasn't just a man of spreadsheets and meetings, but someone capable of feeling something real? In the days following the challenge, the CEO couldn't shake the thought from his mind. He walked through the office, his thoughts constantly returning to the janitor's proposition. Could he learn a piece of Chopin well enough to impress the room? The thought of playing piano in front of his staff made his stomach churn with a mix of anxiety and frustration. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how unprepared he was. He had spent so many years focused on climbing the corporate ladder, managing deals, negotiating partnerships, and leading teams. But playing the piano? That was something he had never bothered with. He had a basic understanding of music, of course, who didn't? But the delicate complexities of a Chopin piece were a different story altogether. He sat at his desk one afternoon, staring at his computer screen but not really seeing anything. His mind kept returning to the image of the janitor, sitting quietly and confidently, offering up a challenge that seemed so simple but carried so much weight. The janitor had done the unthinkable. He had stood up to the CEO, someone who was seen as invincible in the corporate world, and had turned the tables with a single, unexpected challenge. The CEO had laughed it off at first, not taking it seriously. But now in the quiet of his office, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He had to at least try. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Get me a piano," he said. "I'm going to need a place to practice." The assistant hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to make of the sudden request. "A piano, sir?" "Yes, a piano. I'll need it in the conference room by tomorrow." The CEO hung up the phone before the assistant could ask any more questions. The next day, the conference room was set up with a grand piano at the front. It looked out of place in the otherwise stark and modern space, but it was exactly what the CEO needed. As he walked into the room, he felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. He was used to being in control, used to knowing everything about everything, but this was different. This was an unknown territory. He sat down at the piano and stared at the keys, unsure of where to begin. The challenge was simple enough on the surface, play Chopin. But as his fingers hovered over the ivory keys, he realized just how much he had underestimated the task ahead. He had seen professional pianists perform before, on television, at charity events, and even at some of his company's galas, but he had never really paid attention to what went into it. He had never considered how much practice, patience, and passion were required to truly master the music. Now, faced with the piano in front of him, he realized how much of the music was about feeling, something he didn't exactly excel at in the corporate world. The CEO took a deep breath and pressed down on a key. The sound was flat and awkward, far from the elegance he had hoped for. He tried again, this time a little more confidently, but the result was the same. The notes sounded harsh, out of place. He ran his hands over the keys again, trying to get a feel for the piano, but the music felt foreign to him. It was frustrating, embarrassing even. He had always prided himself on being able to master new challenges, but this was different. Hours passed, and the CEO was no closer to playing the piece. He had made little progress, just a few notes here and there that he could barely string together. His fingers were stiff, and his frustration grew with each failed attempt. He thought about giving up, about telling the janitor that he wasn't cut out for this, but something inside him refused to let him quit. He had accepted the challenge. He couldn't back down now. He spent the next few days trying to improve. The piano became his obsession. Every free moment he was in that conference room, practicing the piece again and again. He struggled through the difficult passages, forcing his fingers to move more fluidly, but it never seemed to sound quite right. It wasn't just the mechanics of the piano that were difficult. It was the emotion behind the music. Chopin's work was delicate, expressive, and deeply emotional, something the CEO wasn't used to tapping into. In business, everything was about numbers, facts, and decisions. Emotions didn't have a place in the equation, but here at the piano it was clear that the music demanded something more. It was frustrating. The CEO was used to being in control, used to solving problems quickly, but this was not something that could be fixed with a sharp mind or a quick solution. This required patience, and that was something he struggled with. At the same time, a part of him began to admire the janitor. The janitor, who worked quietly behind the scenes, had no expectations from the CEO. Yet he had offered him a challenge that had opened up a world the CEO had never considered. He wondered how long the janitor had been playing the piano, how much time he had spent perfecting his craft. He realized that what he had considered an easy challenge was, in fact, a test of something deeper, something that required dedication and heart. Days turned into a week, and the CEO was still far from where he needed to be, but something inside him was changing. He was no longer focused on winning the challenge. He had realized that this was about more than just showing the janitor who was boss. It was about learning something new, about pushing himself outside of his comfort zone. The CEO wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for something larger, the possibility of understanding the world through a different lens. On the morning of the challenge, the CEO was still far from perfect. His fingers were sore, his mind was tired, and he had hardly slept the night before. But he was ready. He had given everything to this challenge, and that was all he could do. As he entered the room where the challenge would take place, he felt a strange mix of pride and fear. He didn't know how this would go, but one thing was certain. He had never been more invested in anything outside of his business. The janitor was already there, sitting quietly at the piano, his fingers moving across the keys with ease. His playing was smooth and confident, and the CEO couldn't help but admire the skill. The CEO took a deep breath and walked over to the piano, his heart pounding in his chest. It was time to face the music, literally. The day of the challenge finally arrived. The atmosphere inside the company's headquarters felt unusually tense, even though no one spoke about it openly. Employees whispered among themselves, exchanging excited glances as they anticipated what was about to unfold. The CEO had agreed to face off against the janitor in a challenge that had become the talk of the office. For days, the CEO had been practicing non-stop. He wasn't just rehearsing notes on the piano. He was wrestling with his pride, his expectations, and the very idea of what it meant to succeed. He had spent most of his life convinced that success was a direct result of intellect and hard work. He had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, and his achievements had reinforced that belief. But now, with the piano in front of him, he was forced to confront something entirely different: the possibility that there was more to life than what could be controlled with strategy and determination. The janitor, on the other hand, had taken a quieter approach. He hadn't been in the conference room since that first moment when he'd issued the challenge. He had spent the past few days preparing for the moment in his own way, by simply practicing the music he loved. Unlike the CEO, he hadn't been frantically trying to force his way through the difficult pieces of Chopin. Instead, he let the music come naturally, finding joy in the act of playing rather than obsessing over perfection. As the hour of the challenge drew closer, the CEO couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach. He had made progress, there was no denying that, but he knew he wasn't where he needed to be. His fingers still fumbled over the keys, and the elegance of Chopin's melodies seemed so far out of reach. He had been so focused on winning that he hadn't really allowed himself to enjoy the experience of playing. The joy of music was still foreign to him, and now he was beginning to wonder if he'd ever truly understand it. When he walked into the conference room, he was surprised to find the janitor already sitting at the piano, his fingers dancing effortlessly across the keys. There was no air of competition about the janitor. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he was simply lost in the music, as if the piano were an extension of himself. His playing was smooth, confident, and filled with an emotional depth that the CEO hadn't anticipated. The CEO hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the situation. He had been so wrapped up in his own preparation that he hadn't considered how the janitor would approach this challenge. The janitor wasn't worried about impressing anyone. He wasn't concerned with how his performance would be perceived. To him, music was something deeply personal, something that had always been a part of who he was. "Are you ready?" the janitor asked, his voice calm and steady. He didn't even look up from the keys, as if he were speaking to a friend rather than a rival. The CEO took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that had started to creep up. "Yeah," he said, his voice more unsure than he would have liked. "Let's do this." They had agreed that the challenge would begin with the janitor playing first. The CEO had insisted on this. He didn't want to feel like he was following the janitor's lead. He wanted to show that he could hold his own, even if the janitor had more experience. The janitor nodded as if it didn't matter to him either way. The first few notes were soft, but they quickly filled the room with a warm, almost haunting sound. The janitor's fingers moved with fluid grace, weaving through the piece with the ease of someone who had spent years perfecting it. He wasn't trying to show off or impress anyone. He was simply letting the music flow through him. The melodies were intricate, filled with emotion and subtlety. For a brief moment, the CEO found himself completely mesmerized. He had heard this piece before, but never like this. The music spoke to something inside him, a raw, human emotion that he had never fully understood until now. It wasn't about the precision of the notes or the technical mastery of the piano. It was about the feeling that poured out of each note, the way the music seemed to come from somewhere deep within the janitor. The CEO felt a lump in his throat as the piece ended, and for the first time he realized that there was something far more valuable than success or winning. There was connection. There was expression. There was art. The janitor stopped playing, his fingers still resting gently on the keys. He didn't look at the CEO. He simply waited for the next part of the challenge to begin. The room was silent save for the soft hum of the piano. It felt like time had stopped, and the CEO was suddenly aware of how much had been missing from his life. When the CEO finally stood to take his place at the piano, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in the business world. He had always been in control, always the one calling the shots. But here, in front of the janitor and the small audience of employees who had gathered, he was just a man trying to play a piece of music that seemed beyond his reach. He sat down at the piano, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. He had practiced. He had worked hard, but nothing seemed to come out the way he had hoped. His fingers found the notes, but they were clumsy, unsure, Each press of a key seemed forced, unnatural. The music that emerged was stiff and lifeless, lacking the flow that the janitor had brought to the same piece just moments before. The CEO's face flushed with embarrassment. He wanted to stop, to quit before the whole room could see just how poorly he was performing. But he couldn't, not now. Not after everything that had led up to this moment. The employees watching seemed uncomfortable. They had never seen their CEO in such a vulnerable state. He was always the one who exuded confidence, who never failed to come through no matter the challenge. But now as his hands struggled to move across the keys, they could see the cracks in his armor. The CEO, for the first time, wasn't winning. He stopped playing, his hands resting on the piano. The silence in the room felt heavy. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick. He wasn't used to feeling this way, to failing, to showing weakness. It wasn't something he had ever allowed himself to experience. The janitor, who had been quietly observing, looked up from his seat. His expression was unreadable, but then, after a moment, he smiled, not in a mocking way, but in a way that was oddly reassuring. "You're not going to get it right on the first try," he said gently. The CEO looked up, startled. "What?" The janitor nodded. "That's the point. This isn't about perfection. It's about trying. It's about the effort you put in, the willingness to fail and keep going." The CEO stared at him, feeling a strange mixture of frustration and awe. The janitor wasn't concerned with how well the CEO played. He wasn't judging him. He was simply acknowledging that the act of playing, the act of trying, was what mattered most. The CEO took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Maybe it wasn't about winning or losing. Maybe it was about learning something new, about finding a different way to succeed. And for the first time in a long while, the CEO realized that the challenge he had so eagerly accepted was not about proving he was the best. It was about realizing that there was more to life than winning. There was the beauty of the journey, the connection between people, and the music that could speak louder than any business deal ever could. He took his seat again and began to play. This time he didn't care about how it sounded. He didn't care about the notes or the timing. He just played. And for the first time, the music felt like a part of him. The room remained silent for a long while. The only sound was the soft tapping of the CEO's fingers on the piano keys, the occasional misshaped note lingering in the air before it was swallowed by the stillness. His playing was far from perfect, and yet for the first time it felt real. The CEO was no longer worrying about what others thought or trying to impress them. He was just playing. The janitor watched from a distance, his expression calm but focused. He wasn't judging the CEO. Instead, he was observing something more important: the effort. It wasn't about getting the piece right. It was about the willingness to step out of one's comfort zone and to embrace the vulnerability of being a beginner. He had seen it many times before with his own students, people who were embarrassed to make mistakes, but who learned that those mistakes were what would ultimately push them forward. As the CEO continued to struggle through the piece, his hand shaking slightly, he realized something he had never considered before. Music wasn't just a skill, it was an experience, something that demanded more than technical ability. It called for emotion, for a willingness to express what was inside even if it wasn't perfectly done. The piano, with its black and white keys, was a mirror, reflecting the deepest parts of him, his frustrations, his doubts, and yes, even his small victories. There was something liberating in this realization. The CEO, who had built an empire through sheer willpower, was learning a lesson he had never expected. He was learning that not everything needed to be controlled, not everything had to be perfect. Life wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about experiencing the journey, the effort, the persistence, and understanding that failure was a part of growth. After what seemed like hours, the CEO stopped playing. He sat there with his hands on the keys, staring down at them as if he were seeing them for the first time. His fingers were sore and his mind was exhausted, but there was a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. His chest wasn't tight with the usual pressures of business. He felt in a strange way lighter. The janitor approached him slowly, his footsteps quiet on the polished floor. "How does it feel?" he asked, his voice gentle but knowing. The CEO looked up at him, a little surprised by the question. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "It feels different. I've spent my entire life focused on what I can control, on how to win. But this is something I can't control. It's like trying to make something perfect when you know you'll never get it exactly right. The janitor nodded. That's the beauty of it, though. Perfection is an illusion. It's not about getting it right. It's about the experience. Every time you play, you learn something new, even if it's just one note at a time. The CEO thought about this for a moment. He had spent years building his company, making decisions that would push him to the top, always striving for the best. But in that pursuit, he had forgotten what it was like to simply be present, to lose himself in something as simple as playing a piano. You're right, the CEO finally said, his voice quieter now, more reflective. It's not about getting everything right. It's about being okay with not being perfect. The janitor smiled slightly, a faint glimmer of pride in his eyes. Exactly. Perfection can stifle growth. It can make you afraid to take risks. But when you accept that you'll make mistakes along the way, that's when the real learning happens. There was a long pause. The CEO wasn't sure what to say next. This conversation, this moment, was unlike anything he had ever experienced in the corporate world. In business, there were clear goals, clear outcomes. But here in this room, there was only the present, the music, the effort, and the shared understanding between the two of them. Maybe I've been wrong all along, the CEO said quietly, more to himself than to the janitor. I've always thought that the key to success was being the smartest, the most prepared, the one who could outthink everyone else. But now I see that there's more to it. There's more to life than just being in control. The janitor didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, his hands clasped in front of him. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet understanding. The CEO wasn't the first person to have come to this realization, and he wouldn't be the last. But there was something special about this moment, about the way two very different people had come together over something as simple as music. After a while, the CEO stood up from the piano bench, stretching his sore fingers. He didn't feel like he had won the challenge, but in a way that didn't matter anymore. He had learned something far more important, that success wasn't always about achievement. Sometimes it was about accepting failure, embracing vulnerability, and allowing yourself to grow in ways you never expected. Thank you, the CEO said, his voice filled with gratitude. I didn't just learn about music today. I learned something much bigger. The janitor gave him a slight nod as if to say, "You're welcome." But he didn't seem interested in basking in the CEO's praise. This wasn't about recognition for him. It was about the connection they had made through the simple act of playing music together, something that transcended status and power. As the CEO left the room, he felt lighter. He didn't know what the future held for him, or how this experience would change his approach to business. But he was certain of one thing. He would never look at success the same way again. He had been so focused on the destination that he had forgotten to appreciate the journey. Later that afternoon, the CEO called a meeting with his senior team. They had gathered to discuss the company's next big move, but this time the atmosphere was different. The CEO was no longer rigid and authoritative. He didn't enter the room with the same confidence he usually had, the kind that demanded respect and obedience. Instead, he entered with a quiet humility, a recognition that there was more to leadership than simply making decisions. As the meeting began, the CEO looked around the room, noticing how his team seemed to be waiting for him to assert control, to take charge as he always had. But today something had shifted. He was no longer the person they thought he was, the invincible CEO who always had the answers. Today he was just another person in the room, open to new ideas, willing to listen, and most importantly, not afraid to fail. For the first time, the CEO didn't try to dominate the conversation. Instead, he encouraged his team to speak freely, to share their thoughts without fear of being wrong. He was no longer interested in proving himself. He was interested in collaboration, in learning from others, and in growing together. And as the meeting went on, he realized that this shift in perspective had already begun to change the way he saw his business, his leadership, and even his life. By the time the meeting ended, the CEO felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't worried about the next big deal or the next step in his career. Instead, he was focused on the here and now, on the people around him, the music in his life, and the quiet realization that success, true success, came from a willingness to embrace failure and vulnerability. As he left the meeting room, he found himself looking forward to something he had never thought about before, playing the piano again. Not to prove a point, not to win, but simply for the love of the music. The days following the piano challenge were quiet, but in a way that felt almost peaceful. The CEO, who had always been a whirlwind of energy and decisions, found himself moving more slowly, more thoughtfully. There was a shift in him that even the people who worked closest to him began to notice. The tension in his shoulders had softened, and his usual sharp, calculated tone was replaced with something more genuine, more open. He found himself thinking about the janitor more than he expected. It wasn't just about the piano anymore, or the challenge, or even the music. It was about the realization that the janitor had taught him, something he had never learned in all his years of business, the value of humility and the importance of vulnerability. The CEO had spent his entire life proving himself, climbing the corporate ladder with a fierce determination to always be the best, to always be in control. But the janitor, in one simple act, had made him question everything. Music, something the CEO had never really thought about beyond its function as background noise, had shown him that there was more to life than what he could control. There was beauty in uncertainty. There was strength in allowing yourself to fail, to stumble, and to get back up again. But it wasn't just that lesson that stayed with him. It was the way the janitor had approached the challenge, so calm and unassuming. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He hadn't needed to win. He had simply shared his passion for music, offering the CEO a glimpse into a world where success wasn't measured by numbers or accolades, but by the act of creating, of feeling, of being present in the moment. The CEO found himself wanting to know more about the janitor, the man who had somehow turned his world upside down with a simple challenge. So he made a decision. He would take a walk around the building, not as the CEO, but as a man who was simply curious about another person's life. He wanted to know what had driven the janitor to learn the piano, why music meant so much to him, and what he could learn from this humble, unassuming man. Later that afternoon, after a meeting had wrapped up, the CEO took a walk through the halls of the building. He had no real purpose, other than to simply observe the everyday lives of those around him. The employees who passed by didn't look at him the way they usually did. They didn't see him as the CEO, the powerful figure who had made so many decisions that affected their lives. They saw him as just another person, walking quietly through the halls. He didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it. As he walked past the janitor's usual cleaning station, he saw him again, pushing a cart down the hallway. The janitor's movements were slow and deliberate, his head down as he focused on the task at hand. The CEO hesitated for a moment, then approached him. "You have a moment?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. The janitor looked up, clearly surprised. "Of course, sir," he replied, pausing for a moment before continuing. "Is everything all right?" The CEO nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for the challenge, and for showing me something I never really understood." The janitor tilted his head slightly as if he didn't quite understand. "I just played the piano, sir. I don't think I did anything special." "You did more than you know," the CEO said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "You showed me that success isn't about control. It's not about being the best at everything. It's about being open to new experiences, to learning from others, and to embracing vulnerability." The janitor stood silently for a moment, as if processing the CEO's words. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said again. "I just did what I love." "I know," the CEO replied, his smile widening. "And that's exactly why it meant so much." The two men stood there for a moment, exchanging a quiet understanding. It wasn't about the piano anymore. It wasn't about the challenge. It was about a simple, unspoken connection between two people who had come from very different worlds, but had learned something valuable from each other. The CEO stood for a moment longer, then nodded. "I think I have a lot to learn," he said softly, "and I think you've helped me start that journey." With that, he turned and began to walk away, feeling something inside him shift even further. It wasn't just about playing the piano, or even about leading a company. It was about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their position, and understanding that everyone had something to offer. It was about finding the things that mattered most, beyond the numbers and the deadlines. The next few weeks were filled with subtle changes. The CEO continued to lead his company with the same dedication he always had, but now there was a new sense of purpose in everything he did. He wasn't just focused on making deals or securing profits. He was focused on building relationships, on listening to his team, and on learning from the people around him. He took more time to connect with his employees, not as a boss, but as someone who valued their thoughts, their ideas, and their contributions. He made a point to attend company events that weren't just about business, but about community, about bringing people together to share experiences and to learn from each other. And every so often, when the weight of his responsibilities began to feel too heavy, the CEO would find himself walking to the conference room, where the piano still sat, quietly waiting. He would sit down at the bench, his fingers grazing the keys, and for a few moments he would lose himself in the music. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It was simply about the joy of playing, about finding peace in something as simple as the sound of the piano filling the room. The janitor, of course, continued his work, moving quietly through the halls, always doing his job with the same care and attention to detail. But sometimes when the CEO would pass by him in the hall, there would be a knowing smile between them, a silent acknowledgement that they had both learned something important. The janitor didn't need to say anything. His role in the CEO's transformation was already clear. He had shown him that success wasn't about winning, but about learning, about embracing the process, and about finding beauty in unexpected places. In the end, the challenge had been far more than a test of piano skills. It had been a lesson in humility, in growth, and in the power of connection. It had shown the CEO that there was more to life than just control. There was also the beauty of surrender, the freedom of allowing yourself to fail, and the strength that comes from simply being present. As the days passed, the CEO's transformation became more apparent, not just in the way he approached his work, but in the way he interacted with others. He had found something in that quiet, humble janitor, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And for the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive, not because of the power he held, but because of the simple, human connection he had discovered.